Chicago Calling was released late in the winter of 1951. At its core, it's a working-class melodrama centered around Dan Duryea. He plays struggling LA photographer Bill, whose drinking habits, as well as general unemployment, estrange him from his wife and daughter, culminating in her leaving him. Following another binge, he returns home, and just as he's to have his telephone removed for not having paid the overdue bills, he receives an urgent telegram informing him of a car accident his daughter had been in, who is forced to undergo surgery. His wife is to call him tomorrow to update him. In desperation, Bill persuades Jim, the telephone lineman, to keep the phone there for another day as he attempts to find a way to pay off the $30 debt. Rather than its contrived premise, Chicago Calling is noteworthy for its location shooting all around Bunker Hill and the Sunshine Apartments. Most of the film's charm comes from those moments that directly explore the region and linger on its architecture, like the awkwardness of the staircase ascending to Bill's apartment, where characters are forced to squeeze past one another. Its director, the Austrian-born John Reinhardt, had been a minor figure in the B-noir sphere throughout the 1940s, directing among others the hyper-frugal The Guilty, whose walls and set designs are draped in pure poverty and decay, likely shot on some abandoned backlot and monogram pictures. You can practically feel the cheapness seeping through every pore of that film. The contrast between The Guilty and Chicago Calling, equally a low-budget B-film, in the career of Reinhardt, reveals a considerable shift that noir itself undertook between the passing of decades. In fact, it seems that it is precisely this malleability of noir that has greatly contributed to its lifespan. In potentially the first book on film noir, French critic Raymond Board described it as an amalgamation of realistic sequences that, when put together, turn out anything but realistic, but rather its opposite. A term that frequently falls is Oneirism. Indeed, a strange ambivalent quality befalls many of the early noirs. Though the core characteristics of noir have been much disputed throughout the decades, the initial essence for Board lay in its incoherence, that special something that escapes our grip. Such observations feel vindicated when watching the early films. It abounds in The Big Sleep, persists in The Dark Corner, and crescendos in Lady from Shanghai, in an atmosphere of total malaise. Even before the term was coined, German critic Siegfried Krakauer remarked on these new crime films in an essay entitled Terror Films, in which he likened them to horror pictures, where the fear of the traditional horror film is transplanted onto an everyday setting. Small towns and city districts replace castles and mansions. He explicitly mentions Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt, but its descriptions could have easily been used for Stranger from the Third Floor, Double Indemnity, or others. Early successes led to a proliferation of noir films, step by step losing some of the original qualities, yet in the act of repetition, slowly changing to something new. The noir film of 1948 and 1949 is a far cry removed from the one of 1944. Feast Highway has little of Dark Corner, Scandal Sheet little of Double Indemnity. By the end of the 40s, the Oneirism of noir had faded, as the demand for noir authenticity rose. As with most genres, such had pluralistic influences, both in content and form. For one, the social realist film of the 1930s. These were films that dialed in on their given milieu, often given a new feel for the urban landscape, and injecting the American cinema with an unprecedented harsh and ugliness befitting of the social injustices during and following the Depression they were protesting against, found in the many films of Mervyn LeRoy, such as Fugitive from a Chain Gang, with its earnest rage and deeply layered pessimism, or Wild Boys of the Road, a curio that seemed unfilmable just 5 years earlier, occurring just before a renewed fortification of the Hollywood style. The second wave of noir also seems crucially informed by Neo-realism. Of course, Neo-realism, as it is understood, was a distinctively Italian phenomenon, directly linked to the country's history of classicism, fascism, and the resistance against it. Nevertheless, its accentuation of behavior within a given milieu, the experience of reality, elements American directors found capable of integrating. Rather than inherit its symbolic meaning, the American cinema took from Neo-realism the impulse for the real, both for better and worse, as it yielded in many tepid, desultory films where location shoots expiated for lacking scripts and performances. One war had ended, another destined to begin. The fears of 1944 were not the fears of 1951. McCarthyism replaced Nazism, and Noir as a beacon of public fear had to replicate that. There's very little Oneirism about M, about the mob, about Chicago Calling, just as there had been very little Oneirism about the Cold War and the Hollywood blacklistings. The Noirs of the 50s thus had and needed a new look, removed from the nightmarish artificiality of its predecessors. We find a culmination of the social justice film and the frugality, the newfound interest and acceptance in realism. Gritty, harsh, downright naked to some extent, as in The Sniper. You're given a man, a city, and a chase. Noir now looked like Edmund O'Brien scudding through the open streets of California and DOA, scenes for which permits were not acquired. The noirness of the films, however much it may have differed over the years, remains the same however, and comes largely in the alignment between mise-en-scene and mental state. The passing of the war brought forth a collective change, and it is this unyielding realism which added an additional layer of cruelty to many of the films, which burst beyond the palpable, totally unobfuscated, which is where we find the psychotic films Paul Schrader once announced as the culmination of the genre. Realism had always played a part of noir, but initially found itself infused by studio fog. By the 50s, it became too strong to suppress. Chicago Calling falls within this time frame. It too concerns personal dignity and emasculation, and the fundamentally good man Bill, who must confront his own inadequacy and find a new way to be useful. Bunker Hill is the location of choice for Chicago Calling, in general a popular one for the seedy films of the time. Cry Danger, Kiss Me Deadly, and M, among others, took place here. Those films gained an additional layer of depth, for they filmed an area in its last days, just a few years before the entire district would undergo rampant renovation, a desperate attempt by the city to cleanse the area, in the process also stripping it of its character. Kent Mackenzie's great The Exiles and the Bunker Hill documentary deal further with this and the harm this caused the marginalized communities that had inhabited Bunker Hill. Though a white American, Bill falls within this too. Where would he go 10 years from now? Beyond the clairvoyant, social criticisms littered throughout the film, particularly in the labyrinthian mess that becomes the telephone. The advertised ease of communication becomes a burden, of which Bill can't free himself from. It becomes the focus of his life. In the various texts on Chicago Calling, one will find the ostensible neo-realist aspect of the film highlighted, nurtured through the relationship of Bill and Bobby, as well as Bill and his dog, which so resembles the Seeker. Chicago Calling is far less elaborate, and instead does often rely on melodrama to move forward, which hampers it, but makes for an interesting contrast between the two modes of operation. Noir bursted slowly towards insanity. The films of the 50s reap what the early films hinted at but could never pursue without veiling it in innuendos. Chicago Calling is not as violent, but it reaches its own burst, one that threatens to disrupt the homogeneity of the Hollywood ending.